Alex, I've got a quick question for Steve Rintoul. Firstly, I'm absolutely shattered at the work I've done on sea ice thickness, not over the last 50 years, but over the last 80 years. It's totally worthless. But your talk highlighted another change that's occurred, and that's the absolute explosion of scientific literature, mostly in open access journals. There are so many papers published now that you just can't keep up with anything other than a very small part of a field. And you said that sea ice thickness scaled with volume. I've totally missed any papers on measuring sea ice volume. Did you mean thickness scaled with extent?
Yes. To help with the literature, every scientist now has an artificial intelligence system that processes knows what you already know and identifies the things you need to know.
Send them the PDF. This is a comment as much as a question, and it relates not to the value of looking ahead 50 years, but to the accuracy, and I guess it's pretty obvious. But I mean, the one thing that we as a community and the rest of humankind has been really bad at is predicting both the pace of development of technology and its direction. For those of you old enough to remember that sci-fi movies of the 50s and 60s, it was all about flying cars, and somehow computers didn't really get in there. And so this is surely going to apply to many of the comments that you've made. And coming in from the field of biology and genomics, if you were to have asked us in 1964 about the concept of genome or metagenome sequencing, the terms hadn't even been invented for another 20-something years. And we were only 10 years after understanding that DNA was actually a double helix. So jumping forward 50 years, I suspect we're in for a surprise or two, those of us that are alive then.
I don't think anyone up here would disagree. The assignment was 50 years ahead, and so we tried to do the assignment. When I was thinking about it, I think I was struck both by how long a time 50 years can be in terms of trying to forecast, but also how short it can be. And there are some aspects in terms of, if you look at the models that are assessed in the IPCC reports for changes over the next several decades out to 50 years, for many properties, the changes are not dramatic. So I do agree that I think the biggest change in what we know and how we do it is going to be technology driven rather than changes in the environment over that time.
Just add a few words. I think the problem with Antarctic research, as we all know, is that it's very expensive business doing research, and it's particularly expensive getting people into Antarctica. There are several of us that talked about the opportunity of autonomous vehicles in Antarctica, and I think that's going to be influencing lots of different areas of science, on the oceans and the ice, in lots of different ways. And it's important to recognise that. There's lots of things to do still. But I think also there's going to be a development of satellite technology as well. I mean, if we're going to understand change in Antarctica, we need monitoring systems that are simply absent at the moment, not just in a few places, but in many places, and regular long time series to be developed. And I really can't see that there's any feasible way of doing that, given how expensive it is putting people into Antarctica, other than getting better satellites, more clever satellites, getting the information that we really need. And that's just on the surface of the ice sheet. But at some stage in the future, getting satellites to be able to look underneath the ice sheet as well.
Yes. Talking about resources, once NASA was saying that there was a decrease of sea ice in the Arctic. I mean, that is a forerunner of what, some of the signals of climate change is there already. But after that, the whole issue of decreasing of sea ice in the Arctic sort of went away and submerged with the grab for the Arctic. And I would tend to think that it may be the same for the Antarctic. Thank you. For Steve.
Oh, for me.
Which one? There are two of us.
For you.
As a speaker,
Yes, I agree. I don't think it's gone away so much as the perspective we might have on which elements are important. So if you follow the scientific literature, I think that the question of the rates and change and thickness is still there. What our attention has been drawn to is, for example, and in the words of a historian of conflict, was the fact that there was something of a developing dispute in the first edition of his book called Climate Wars, and this is the fellow called Gwyn Dyer. He raised a chapter on a pending conflict between Russia and Norway about access to the Arctic. And then in the revision of his book, he had to remove it because they developed an agreement to continue exploiting the area together. So you're right in the sense that there will be changes in the political arrangements, and they may be very quick. And hence the fact that I drew attention to the fact that quite a bit of our knowledge of what's happening in terms of the natural world, we actually have sufficient information at our disposal to make some judgments on what we think we should do to limit that, but we aren't doing it. So, for example, in the audience here, and you will hear amongst our scientific colleagues, we've already shifted our baseline not to what we should do about the change, but how we should better understand the change and what we may expect in terms of its biological impacts. Now, that may just be because we've had a change influence over the past couple of days, but it does strike me that we continue to shift our goals and our perspectives on what we think is important in the scientific area, and that influences what we think we can do as humans anyway. So I do think that we have this situation where we've accepted we're going to change, and maybe that will encourage us just to accept further change, because after all, once you pass the, gee, it's all going to change.
Yeah, first of all, thanks a lot for all these very entertaining talks, because it was really nice, and I think we should have started by the talks that would have given more ideas for this scan, especially with Steve's projections. You were mentioning a lot about how much the environmental changes, the physical changes of the environment were somehow limited. But don't you think that the harvesting of the resources will be the major issue that will come into play? Because one of the things on the first Marta Timiu's poster is that the population will increase, and there will be a real demand for harvesting the resources, and that's where the tipping point in the ecosystem may be reached. So I don't know who wants to answer, if it's Jose or Steve, but I'd like to hear your view on how this is going to really affect much more than climate change Antarctica.
Well, the obvious answer is that we are already good that we have major organizations working on that. So we have, have CAMLAR, for example, that is really addressing that. The other thing that I find is quite good is in terms of policy making with the Antarctic Treaty, and the Commission for Environmental Protection is actually looking at this very clearly. What is really one of the hot topics is actually the establishment of marine protected areas and its value. It's something that in the last 2 days we've been addressing that very clearly. Not only its value of establishing them, but actually what they can tell us as a major, probably good way to protect the resources that we have in the Southern Ocean. But I think we have to be very clear, actually not only establishing them, but actually are they efficient? Do they make any sense? But not only for us, that more relation with conservation, but actually working with the people and the countries and those that are highly interested in exploiting, because exploiting those resources in a sustainable way. That pressure will definitely be high. And I think we have to combine these different disciplines, like we heard today, from the ice melting that will affect oceanography, that will affect the biology, that will affect conservation and politics. One thing that really it's crucial is that we have to combine all these players and talking in a very simple language that actually everybody will understand to make the right decisions.
I just add that it's, I think it is plausible that, if not likely, that the biggest impacts will be human-driven ones, direct ones, not just through climate. And I guess personally, if there were still wild-caught fisheries in 50 years, I'd be surprised, actually. I mean, the idea of a wild harvesting of protein on land seems bizarre to us now. We get our meal by hunting wild animals. So I suspect it might become that way in the ocean.
Question for Neil Gilbert. Neil, thank you for a very good speech and discussion on the treaty system and where we might go in the next 50 years or so. In two very clear paths, which I guess most of us would favour the latter. You also mentioned that the real tipping point is going to be in the next 10 to 15 years, which will be in, I would suggest, all of this room's lifetime. So that means there's an audience that can do something about it. And I'd be interested in your views on, what next for this room?
Yes, thank you, Peter. I think for me it's a question of how we build resilience into the political system now by the decisions that we're taking in the very immediate future, and how reliable those decisions are, and how we can make sure that they are based on the best available scientific information. So when we look ahead to the potential risks around a race for fishing, for example, how well can we set CAMLR up now on the basis of the best available science to build resilience into the political system to push that inevitability off as far as we possibly can? So my point really was around the decision making that we're doing in the very near term, the ability of the science community to translate what it knows about Antarctica and about some of the risks and threats that you see to Antarctica in the future, how well that's communicated to the policymakers, and how effective they are in using that information to make decisions that build that resilience in for the longer term. That for me is the challenge.